My guest today is Eylon Levy, former spokesman for the State of Israel and one of the most globally recognized voices defending Israel since October 7th. Eylon holds degrees from Oxford and Cambridge, moved to Israel from the United Kingdom in 2014, and served in the IDF as a lone soldier. He later served as international spokesman to Israeli President Isaac Herzog after a career as a television news anchor. He's also the New York Times best-selling translator of Eli Sharabi's historic memoir of Hamas captivity, Hostage, and other influential works of Hebrew nonfiction. Now heads the Spokes Office, a civil society initiative advocating for Israel and the Jewish people on international media, and he hosts the podcast Eylon the Record, available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Eylon, thank you for joining me.
Hello, glad to join you. A very good night or a good afternoon where you are.
Before anything else, you were in Gaza today, Wednesday, January 21st, embedded with the IDF. As far as I know, this is the first interview you're giving since coming out. What did you see with your own eyes that the world is still getting completely wrong about Gaza right now?
You know, going into Gaza today, I felt incredible frustration because for 2 years, I was warning that if this was not the last Gaza war, there will be a next Gaza war because Hamas will build up its terrorist army again. It will reassert its grip on the population and it will prepare to continue its jihad against Israel. And here we are, not with the total defeat of Hamas, but with the de facto division of Gaza into two areas, Hamas Gaza and Yellow Gaza. Israel controls half of Gaza, Hamas controls the rest of it. And I'm calling it Yellow Gaza because it's divided by the yellow line. It's literally marked out every few hundred meters by a yellow concrete block. And one thing that really struck me standing on a hill inside Gaza today, overlooking the Deir el-Balah area, is how much of Gaza is still standing. The IDF did not enter the central camps region at all for fear that hostages were being held there. And it means that when we talk about Hamas still being in power, it still controls an urban core in Gaza. It is still the government there. It is still able to impose taxes to clamp down on the local population and to prepare for the next round of fighting against Israel. And I think the world is jumping the gun a little bit, moving towards phase 2 and ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that the Hamas regime has absolutely no intention of disarming. The IDF didn't disarm it completely in 2 years. An international stabilization force is not going to take its guns off it against its will. And therefore, any move forward diplomatically is going to run into that elephant in the room. What do you do with the terrorist army that is still in control of a built-up area where just as the IDF is dismantling tunnels all over the Israeli side, and I didn't realize that there were still tunnel shafts to tunnels they hadn't even explored or mapped yet, the same exists on the Gazan side as well. And they will militarize that for the next war against Israel.
So you think it's just a matter of time that Israel, the IDF goes back in there? Because it seems that phase 2 is something that Hamas is not willing to do.
Well, I hope the IDF doesn't have to go back in because we don't want any more war. We don't want to wake up to news of more soldiers who are killed in battle. But Israel has shifted gears since October 7th. It's shifted from containing threats, saying that they can be deterred or appeased, towards removing them. And now it is giving the diplomatic option a chance if President Trump thinks that he can get other countries on board to disarm Hamas. But if that doesn't happen and Hamas refuses to disarm, then Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying he'll do it the easy way or the hard way. And the hard way would mean the IDF going in. And President Trump has indicated if Hamas continues to resist the demand to disarm, then he'll give the IDF his blessing. I can only hope that if that happens, the whole world will understand that Israel gave the diplomatic option a chance and was left with no choice. But Israel cannot accept Hamas remaining in control of this terrorist state on its borders, even if the IDF controls a buffer zone inside Gaza. We just can't go back to a reality where they have rockets that they can fire at Israel at will. That just can't happen.
I appreciate the update. What are you focused on personally right now? What made you decide to bring your podcast back at this moment? Would be happy to hear.
What am I not doing? First of all, the war itself is officially over, but Israel is still grabbing headlines around the world. And so the initiative that I lead, the Spokes Office, Israel's Citizen Voice of the World, wants to get the most eloquent voices in the Jewish world, not just in Israel, and push them into the international media. I had an initiative funded by private donors that is taking the best voices the Jewish people have and trying to place them in the international media. We're building a dream team of volunteers who want to give their time to speak up for us. We're not giving them message sheets and telling them, you have to say this, you have to say that. I trust their judgment. But we want to have a presence in the world media for all the experts we have because we're being completely drowned out. So I had that initiative. I'm giving interviews myself. I'm on the Israeli media several times a week. I'm translating a number of hostage books at the moment. I translated Eli Sharabi's book. I've just finished another one, and I'm helping Elia Cohen produce his book in English now. And on top of all that, as you said, I'm relaunching my podcast, which is very exciting. I had State of a Nation from the time that I was still in the Prime Minister's office. We put that on hiatus a few months ago, and it's back now in a new format called Eylon the Record, on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the entire plug. And for me, it's a change of gear because I'm not in a suit, I'm not in a tie. It's a more casual approach where I can take a step back and look at what the experience of the last 2 years has taught me about the world, about the centrality of Israel, and apply some of that thinking in some conversations that can hopefully be a little bit freer than they were when we were still running for our lives.
What kind of conversations do you feel are completely missing from the mainstream media? What do you feel is most urgent for you to personally say right now to the world after what we've witnessed in the past 2 years?
I think sometimes in the international media, and look, it's inevitable when people are following 100 stories at once, but the nuance gets completely ironed out of what is happening. The images lead and not the context and not the deeper story and not the deeper issues. I look, for example, at the coverage of Israel's actions against UNRWA. And it's a disaster because there's a lack of willingness in the international media to recognize that UNRWA is a terrorist organization. UNRWA is an integral part of Hamas's wartime economy. It educated 70% of the October 7 monsters. Its staff took part in the October 7th massacre. They took hostages. They held hostages. The UN has never apologized for that. They are completely in hoc with Hamas. And even worse than that, they've perpetuated this conflict for decades by telling Palestinians in Gaza that Gaza is not their home, that they have a right to move to Tel Aviv and get free healthcare at the expense of the European taxpayer till that happens. And so is it any wonder that they grow up wanting to wage jihad, because that's what the world is subsidizing them to do? All of that gets completely ironed out of the media coverage when Israel takes a bulldozer to the UNRWA headquarters in Jerusalem, and the usual suspects of human rights organizations complain that Israel is, trampling international law and whatever, instead of looking at the reality, which is a UN agency completely hijacked by the Palestinian nationalist cause. It exists to advance the Palestinian nationalist cause. So I think there are many angles of the story. By the way, a whole host of issues about domestic Israeli affairs that don't receive airtime abroad, that it's really important for me to bring to the table so that people can understand what is happening here in a much greater resolution than you get from the broad brushstrokes of the international media and the usual medley of human rights organizations and UN agencies they rely on.
Now, we know the root cause of Hamas and Hezbollah was Iran. And Iran right now is facing widespread internal unrest, protests, mass executions, and internet shutdowns. How fragile do you think is the regime is right now?
Well, hang on, I'll answer your question, but first I'm going to push back on the preamble to it. I don't think it's true that the root cause of Hamas is Iran. Fobbing off the problem of Hamas and saying Iran is to blame is like fobbing off Hamas and saying it's Hamas to blame and not other Palestinians in Gaza. The fact is, Hamas reflects very faithfully the core of the Palestinian nationalist ethos, the belief that Israel is an illegitimate settler colonial state that has no right to exist and must be conquered by force of arms. That is why support for Hamas tripled in the West Bank after the October 7th massacre. It's why a majority in Gaza thought that the October 7th massacre was a good idea for well over a year into the war. And it's why Hamas are generally seen as heroes, especially in the West Bank, where people have not suffered the immediate consequences of them. Right? Hamas existed long before the Iranian regime became its patron. It was really only after the Second Intifada that Hamas accepted Iran's protection and came under its umbrella and took its funding. So I think we diminish the problem when we say we outsource it to Iran. And I think we diminish the problem when we outsource it to Hamas instead of recognizing the ideology that motivated Hamas, that led people to celebrate October 7th when it happened. But as to your question about the Iranian regime, look, the honest answer is no one knows exactly what is happening in Iran because the regime has switched off the internet. They did that to stop us seeing how they are massacring protesters, and they did it to stop the protesters from communicating between themselves. The Iranian regime has been acting in strange ways, though, because it doesn't look like they've been trying to get the US off their back. It looks like they've been trying to actively egg the United States on. Khamenei did not have to goad Donald Trump on Twitter and offend his ego, leading Trump to tell News Nation that, if they put a foot in the wrong place, we're going to wipe them off the map. The regime has certainly been challenged in a way that it never has before, but we're not really seeing any signs of defections or splits within the regime itself. Now, maybe that's happening and we're just not seeing it because they switched off the internet, but at the moment, the impression at least is there is a very broad uprising that the Islamic regime itself is holding firm. But look, I don't know when we're planning on getting this podcast out. Israelis know that this is the kind of night you sleep with pajamas, let me put it like that, because we never know when the US could surprise Iran with an attack and if Iran will decide to respond by attacking us and surprising us that way.
Now, how does Iran use Israel as like a pressure valve or an excuse for its internal failures?
You see that any regime that wants to deflect from its own failures finds a scapegoat. And for Iran, that scapegoat is Israel. With the cries of death to America and death to Israel you hear in the Islamic regime, they're trying to find a common enemy. What's fascinating is that from what we're seeing coming out of Iran, a lot of the protesters are chanting, neither Hamas, neither Gaza nor Lebanon, my life is for Iran. They despise what the Palestinian cause has done to them and how it's contributed to their oppression. And they can see through what the regime is trying to do. I don't know how successful that has gone for the Iranian regime. The really fascinating question is how the Islamic Republic has used Israel as a wedge issue, not domestically, but in the West. And to what extent Iran has been active in pumping out propaganda and disinformation and funding certain activist groups, and a lot of this remains to be investigated, in order to exploit the Jews as a wedge issue in the West, identifying that this is something that people care passionately about. The West is very susceptible to conspiracy theories about Jews, and so this is an excellent way to play sides off against each other in the West. We certainly see Al Jazeera, Qatar doing it through Al Jazeera, and I expect that Iran is playing exactly the same game.
What exactly do you think the West still misunderstands about this Iranian regime?
That they literally mean it. They really mean it. The Iranian regime is rooted in a fundamentalist, apocalyptic vision of the world that sounds so insane to the Western world that they think they can't possibly believe it, and that they're ultimately rational actors. And I think the West misunderstands that when the Iranian regime says death to Israel, they really mean it. I mean, I've had conversations with European diplomats and raised the cries of death to Israel, and they'll dismiss it as being all rhetoric and the Iranian regime doesn't mean it and it's acting in a purely defensive posture. I think people who believe in universal values often make the mistake of thinking those values are held universally. And they're not. And sometimes people who are rooted in a radical, revolutionary religious ideology really see the world through a different logic. And that's what's at play with the Islamic Republic. And they really mean it. I think it's not something people understand.
Now, something that's confusing is that they do still have Jews living in Iran, thousands of them. Of course, there were a lot more living there before the revolution. They claim to say that we don't have a problem with Judaism, we don't have a problem with Jews, but we have a problem with Israel and Zionists. Do you think that is the case, or are they just lying?
So what you're telling me is the Iranian regime is saying we have no problem with Jews as long as they are a tolerated minority we can abuse at our will, but we don't want them living with equality on the international stage in the family of nations. Okay, sure. I can believe that the Iranian regime is happy keeping the Jews in persecuted minority status, and that's exactly what they are in Iran. They're not free and they're terrorized by the regime, and there's a reason that very few of them remain. I think the Iranian regime, like extremist Muslim regimes throughout history, is happy keeping Jews as a small persecuted minority under the umbrella of Islam. The problem is, we Jews don't see our identity as Jews as being a small religious group that is happy to live defenseless and at the whim of other regimes. The lesson we learned the hard way through history: one, we're a people, not a religion. That is something the Iranians cannot accept. And the insistence that the Jews are just a religion and not a national group is part of the anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist prejudice against them. And the second point is that we believe that as a people, we have a right to our own homeland and to defend ourselves. That is anathema to the Iranian regime, which doesn't see the Jews as a people, definitely doesn't think they have a right to self-determine, and in reality, in its actions, has not only tried to wage a war of annihilation against Israel, it has also targeted Jews and Israeli targets around the world, hunting us to the four corners of the earth. So no, obviously I don't accept the Iranian regime's attempts to put lipstick on a pig, if I can use a haram analogy.
Now, do you think that this Iranian opposition is strong enough to actually challenge this regime, or is it going to be crushed into silence if they don't get help from the outside?
First, they may get help from the outside. President Trump has said help is on its way, and I hope it is on its way, because otherwise it's a terrible blow to America's credibility, much worse than Obama's red line. Much, much worse than Obama's red line. And George H.W. Bush egging on the Iraqis to rebel against Saddam Hussein if Trump does not intervene to support the uprising in Iran right now. But I get back to the same point, that protests on the street alone do not bring down a regime. At some point, you need it to crack. At some point, you need someone in the regime to defect and to move the center of gravity of power towards some sort of transition. I haven't seen any indication that that is happening. But again, there's an internet blackout in Iran. We don't really know what's going on in there. There is, of course, another problem, that the opposition is not united around a certain figurehead. There is no main opposition leader waiting to sweep in the way that Khomeini was back in 1979. There is, of course, the crown prince, Reza Pahlavi. I think he's a good and decent man. He wants to transform Iran into a peaceful liberal democracy, and the world could do much worse than that. And there is a very strong faction of Iranian monarchists who want to restore the Shah, at least as a ceremonial figurehead leader or leading some sort of transition. But that idea itself is also obviously controversial inside Iran, and not everyone, or even necessarily a majority, wants that. And of course, we have no way of knowing exactly what public opinion is. I think Iran could do much worse than having Reza Pahlavi chair a transition towards a democratic constitution. But whether that happened depends on whether the United States and the world decides that it's going to try to take advantage of this and install him somehow. But as long as it's just people in the streets chanting and attacking a security guard here and there, that alone does not bring down a regime if they're strong enough to remain intact.
Now, let's say the Iranian regime collapsed tomorrow.
From your mouth to God's ears.
How would the Middle East change overnight? I think most people are not aware of what the relationship between Iran and Israel was before 1979. You had direct flights, you had an embassy, right? You had good relations. You think we can ever go back to that? And then, hopefully they lose control of their proxies. Speak a little bit about best case scenario, what it would look like.
Yeah, in the year 1978, there were direct flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran and no flights between Israel and Egypt. There is, I don't know whether you know this, there is a kids' play park in central Tel Aviv that is built on land owned by Iran. Did you know that? Iran owns the land because it bought it before the revolution to build an embassy in Tel Aviv. The Shah fell and the land was never developed, and Tel Aviv municipality turned it into a play park because it's still legally owned by Iran. What happens after the regime, and we're slightly jumping the gun here, but it depends on what takes the place of the regime. If what takes the place of the regime is the IRGC, okay, let's imagine there's a coup. They replace the supreme leader because they say that he's a hapless old man, really the worst leader Iran has had in millennia. They replace him and install some sort of military dictatorship. Things could get worse, right? They can always get worse. If it's replaced with Reza Pahlavi, I'm sure he'll make peace with Israel on day one, and it would transform the Middle East from edge to edge, because it would dry off funding completely to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to Iranian subversive criminal actors trying to target the United States, Europe. I'm sure you could have an alliance between Israel and a free Iran, who together would completely dominate the Middle East. And hopefully that would be a huge opportunity for peace, because Palestinian radical groups will feel increasingly isolated. But we're really jumping the gun, because the regime hasn't collapsed yet and we don't know what will replace it. Again, I think the world can do much worse than Reza Pahlavi assuming power in a democratic transition. The good news is, of all the countries in the Middle East, Iran has perhaps the best prospect of a transition to democracy. It has a history of limited experience of electoral politics. It has an educated population. It doesn't have a youth bulge. It has a very wealthy and well-connected diaspora. Very different from Iraq, which really was a failed state and a fake state carved out of an Ottoman province with no real history of its own, which collapsed as soon as Saddam Hussein's regime collapsed. I don't think the same would happen in Iran, because although there are different minorities around the fringes, half of Iran is not Persian. It is a country that does have a consciousness of a very ancient heritage and national identity. So what can I say? If they manage to get rid of the supreme leader and the IRGC with it, they'd have a damn good chance of a transition to democracy and peace.
You warned for years that this wasn't the last Gaza war, right? That the next one would be worse.
Yeah.
Do you feel tragically vindicated? What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of October 7th?
Most people fail to realize that October 7th was meant to be much worse than it actually was. And in some horrible, twisted way, October 7th saved us from a much worse fate. I'll explain what I mean. When Gaza invaded on the morning of October 7th, Hamas released a statement calling on Muslim armies around the world to join in. What they expected to happen was that they would force the ring of fire that Iran had created around Israel to activate in synchrony. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, Palestinians in the West Bank, Arabs in Israel would all join in and destroy Israel. They didn't. They didn't quickly enough. But imagine what would have happened on the morning of October 7th if Nasrallah had been woken in his bunker, told that Hamas had attacked Israel, and said, right, do it now. And 6:30 in the morning had sent 30,000 armed Hezbollah terrorists across the border into the Galilee to start abducting Israelis on buses. That was the plan. They just got the timing wrong. So October 7th was, people think of October 7th as a terror attack, a very bad terror attack, an especially brutal and sadistic terror attack. They don't realize that it was the opening shot of a regional war against Israel. And more than that, they don't understand that it was the opening shot of a global war against the Jews, which is what we've been experiencing for the last 2 years. People don't understand that the October 7th massacre was intended to jumpstart a much bigger war, and that is a war that would poison minds in the West against Israel. They want to destroy Israel, and they want to convince people around the world that Israel deserves to be destroyed. That's why Hamas built a tunnel system longer than the New York subway underneath literally everything in Gaza. Today I was in Gaza, they're still finding tunnel shafts, in the knowledge that it would generate images that would anger people around the world and turn them against Israel. And people don't understand how they've fallen into that trap as well, with Hamas's sick game of using civilians as human sacrifices. So in general, I think people they underestimate the threat. And therefore, that would lead them to think that Israel perhaps has overreacted or has slightly lost its senses since October 7th, because they don't understand how close we were to a real war of Armageddon and how important it is that Israel prevents that array of forces from building up along its borders ever again.
Do you think the international response after October 7th unintentionally rewarded Hamas for its atrocities? And was that Hamas
100%.
Was that to begin with?
The international community has, without a doubt, rewarded Hamas for the atrocities of October 7th and directly incentivized the next massacre against Israeli civilians. Look at it from several perspectives. One, the recognition of a non-existent Palestinian state. Hamas has called that one of the fruits of the October 7th massacre. Hamas feels vindicated. That recognition by Britain, France, Australia, Canada, Belgium, etc., has made Hamas national heroes. It is encouraging the Palestinians to look back and think of October 7th as their independent state. And it tells them that terrorism works. You know what else tells them that terrorism works? The international community's response to the hostage taking on October 7th normalized hostage taking as a new and terrifying weapon of war. Because instead of demanding the immediate and unconditional return of the hostages and ramping up pressure on Hamas to do exactly that, Israel was immediately pressured into paying a ransom to get the hostages out. Now, I'm not getting into the argument about whether it was right or wrong to pay the ransom. Frankly, I think we had to get them out. We didn't have a choice. They were holding a gun to our babies' heads. We had to pay the price. But you know what? There's a good reason that most countries have an official policy of not paying ransoms to terrorist hostage takers, because it encourages more hostage taking. But Britain's own counter-terrorism manual says that it is a violation of British and international law to pay a ransom to terrorist hostage takers. That's what we did. We paid a ransom by letting Palestinian prisoners out of Israeli jails, knowing that this will encourage them to take hostages again to get more prisoners out, and that those prisoners are going to go back and reoffend like they always do. But instead of the world standing by Israel's side and saying, you know what, if you decide to pay that price, that's an argument for you to have domestically. Immediately the pressure was, they paid lip service towards getting the hostages out immediately and unconditionally, and then called for a diplomatic path, a diplomatic channel. That just meant negotiate with the hostage takers for the ransom you're going to pay. And that has absolutely legitimized hostage taking and has absolutely encouraged Hamas to do it again. And then when you look at the huge protests against Israel around the world, Hamas absolutely feels vindicated. It called this one of the fruits of the October 7 massacre as well, in thinking that it has driven a wedge between Israel and its allies. Half of American youth now support Hamas. Most young Americans aged 18 to 24 support Hamas over Israel. That's according to American polling, the Harvard-Harris poll, okay? That's a terrifying result. So when you add everything together, the recognition of a non-existent Palestinian state, the from the river to the sea chants on the streets of London and New York, the immediate knee-jerk international demand that when hostages are taken, Israel needs to pay a ransom, and of course the outrageous allegations of genocide, that libel, all of those have told Hamas that its October 7 strategy worked. And it will do the same if it's given half the chance.
A major part of Hamas's plan was the hostage. Looking at what happened with Gilad Shalit, is there any way that Israel could prevent this from the future? Would a death penalty for terrorists prevent this? Or is this a plan that Hamas can always pull out of their back pocket?
Israel needs to develop a comprehensive national strategy for discouraging hostage taking. I don't know what the answers are, but it's a conversation we need to have because we've just encouraged and invited more hostage taking. I'm not saying this to say we shouldn't have paid the ransom to get the hostages out. I'm so relieved that they're out. I'm just saying we're paying a price to get them out, and we need to confront that price now. One of the options that's being considered is the death penalty for the October 7 terrorists. Now, personally, I object to the death penalty on principle and on balance. I don't like the idea of capital punishment. But I hear the argument when it comes to the October 7th terrorists. Normally, I would say just put someone in prison. That's punishment enough. We don't have to play God and take someone's life. The problem is that when the Hamas terrorists are put in prison, their friends know that if they kidnap more Israelis, if they kidnap more Bibas children, they can get them out. In which case, keeping them in jail is not punishment enough, and it's not effective. It's not effective at deterring. It's not effective punishment. Putting them in jail ends up encouraging more hostage taking. And so I still don't know how I feel about the proposals to reintroduce the death penalty effectively for the October 7th terrorists. But the world definitely needs to understand the conversation that Israel is happening, because we're now left with the mess of how do you discourage more hostage taking when we've just shown them that it works? And now we have to show that hostage taking does not work. I don't know how to do that. Some people will say you need to pass a law that limits the ransom, the number of prisoners you can pay for every hostage taken. But when it's a legal method, there's always a way around it. Other people may say, you know what? If they take hostages, we annex land. It's the only thing they understand. Maybe that's something that needs to be discussed. I don't know, but I do want policymakers in Israel to have a serious discussion about how to prevent hostage taking, and for world leaders who encouraged Israel to pay a ransom with a do as I say, not as I do attitude, knowing that they don't pay ransoms, and if they do, then they lie about it and pretend it never happened, try to help Israel discourage more hostage taking, because otherwise Hamas will do it again. And by the way, it won't necessarily come from the Gaza Strip. Maybe it'll come from Judea and Samaria. It could come from any direction. Who knows? We've shown it works.
Now, what does winning actually mean in Gaza? Not militarily, but strategically. Can this population be de-radicalized?
Of course it can be de-radicalized. It can be de-radicalized because Germany was de-radicalized. And after the Second World War, the German people were brought to look at the Nazis as being responsible for their suffering, not the Allies. Now look, imagine if after the Second World War, all the Germans who were displaced from Eastern Europe had been kept in refugee camps in perpetuity and told that they had a right to go back. Not just them, but their descendants, their grandchildren, had a right to go back. Do you think that the Nazi ideology would have gone away, or would it have been aggravated? Of course it would have been aggravated. But look at what the world is doing now with UNRWA. UNRWA exists to tell the Palestinians that they have a right to move to Israel and to get free healthcare at the expense of the European taxpayer till they do that. Now, I'd ask you, if you get offered free healthcare until you get to move to Tel Aviv, wouldn't you become a terrorist? What kind of incentive is that? UNRWA is aggravating the conflict by fueling the Palestinian myth that uniquely among the tens of millions of people who were displaced at the end of the Second World War, they have a right to turn the clocks back and reverse and erase the state of Israel. That has to end. Gaza can only be rebuilt if UNRWA is demolished. Why? I said this to a European diplomat I met in Brussels a while ago. You can't, from one pocket, pay to rebuild Gaza, and in the other pocket tell them that these are temporary refugee camps and that Gaza is not their home. You can't get angry at Israeli politicians for saying that they don't belong in Gaza and then tell them that they don't belong in Gaza because they deserve to live in Israel. Of course they're going to rebuild Gaza as a launch pad for jihad if you tell them, surprise, this is a brand new refugee camp and this is only temporary. So if we want to de-radicalize the Palestinians, you have to put the funding of the entire system that makes them think the world is backing their demand that one day Israel is going to disappear. The Palestinians are victims. They're victims of their own success and victims of their own lies. When students, purple-haired students on university campuses in the West say Israel is a white settler colonial state, they are encouraging the Palestinians to believe that therefore Israel is temporary, and if they use enough violence, Algeria style, Israel will pack up and leave and they'll go back to Poland. That activity on Canadian campuses is fueling Palestinian radicalism. It's fueling extremism. And if you disconnect that, if you wean them off the ideology that Israel is a temporary entity, and if you stop telling them the world is going to give them unlimited sums of money until they get to move to Israel, then at some point they're going to be forced to confront reality. Right now, they think that time is on their side and that they'll suffer. You know, we in Israel, we have so much more in common than we like to think. We in Israel think that one of our national values is chosen, resilience. They have their own equivalent. They call it sumud, steadfastness, patience. They think they buy enough time, suffer a little bit now, but one day they'll grind us down and Israel will pack up and leave. And so in order to de-radicalize Gaza, we have to get real about the molten core of the ideology that is keeping it radical. And the world does not realize that by keeping them in refugee status and thinking, oh, that's a final status issue, you'll have to solve that in permanent peace negotiations, they are creating a monster. They're creating a monster. That has to end. I don't think that we can have any reconstruction in Gaza unless UNRWA is completely demolished and taken out of the picture. Look, you now have this. The US has now appointed this temporary Gaza government, okay? The technocratic government. It's a government in exile. It's not there on the ground. And it's a Potemkin government Because on the ground in Gaza, you have Hamas. And even if you get rid of Hamas, UNRWA is responsible for the health and education and welfare of 70% of the population of Gaza. UNRWA is the shadow government in Gaza. So what's the point of having a technocratic government take over if the UN says, oh, we're still going to run basic services for most of Gaza's people because Gaza isn't their home and they're going to move back to Israel? It's a disaster and the world doesn't see it. They don't understand it.
Now, you debated at Oxford years ago and were applauded. Today, you will need security. What changed? And was this sudden shift after October 7th, or was this decades in the making?
When I last went back to Oxford a year ago, I had 9 bodyguards. I was meant to have 8, but my Jewish mother thought that wasn't enough, and so got me another one at the last minute. Because the students blocked the entrance to the college, chanting from Oxford to Gaza, long live the Intifada. I don't want these people getting anywhere near me. When I was a student, we managed to defeat a motion to boycott Israel by a margin of 6-1. That could not happen now. When I was in Oxford, we were told that you could have 2 of 3 things. You could get a first-class degree, you could excel at a sport or activity, or you can have friends. Pick 2. Now they told me you can be pro-Israel or have friends. Pick 1. It didn't happen just after October 7th. It was a process that was boiling over time. And it's not just Oxford, it's infected the whole of Western academia as well. Some of it, no doubt, due to Qatari money. Qatar is, of course, the biggest donor to American universities. But it's part of a bigger phenomenon, I think, of woke brain rot that has taken over these institutions. And they use techniques of violent intimidation. So even people who disagree with it just feel scared to stick their necks above the parapet.
Do you feel that Jewish students are still safe on campus, or is that era over?
Jewish students on Western campuses need to realize that they have a mission. They don't have the luxury to just go keep their heads down. They need to speak up, and that puts them in danger. Obviously, it depends campus to campus, but they are being pressured to turn their backs on Israel or be associated with what more and more people think is the new Nazi Germany and the ultimate incarnation of evil, and that they're therefore genocidal baby killers. Yes, we can expect to see more violence against Jewish students on campus because as far as the protesters are concerned, it's just the same as if you had a Nazi student suddenly walking on campus. I do think we have seen effective pressure, legal pressure, financial pressure, reputational pressure. The Trump administration has been able to change things as well, but that's a fight that they need to have. It's the fight of their generation.
Now, you mentioned Qatar. Qatar presents itself as a Western ally while funding Hamas and shaping discourse. How dangerous is that contradiction, and how deep do you think that the Qatari influence actually runs in universities and media?
Qatar is the single biggest donor to American universities. Qatar has spent over $6 billion, most of it in just the last few years. It spent over $100 billion buying influence in the United States. It retains basically every single PR firm in Washington and New York. It has a terrible, pernicious influence. Remember, it was just a few years ago that the other Arab Gulf states completely boycotted and shunned and cut off relations with Qatar. And the Saudis and the US were very clear that Qatar was a state sponsor of terror. Since then, they have poured an absolute ton of money into elite institutions, to ingratiating themselves, into lobbying. And, I remember a while ago, Mehdi Hasan, the mother of the hostage at the time, Emily Damari, went to Britain and begged for pressure on Qatar to put pressure on Hamas to get the hostages out. By the way, ultimately, that's why the hostages came out, right? Because Qatar and Turkey, its state sponsors, told it, game's over, they're a liability more than an asset, you need to free them. And the next week, Britain rolled out the red carpet to the Emir of Qatar and gave him a royal welcome. And is it any surprise that the king gave the Emir of Qatar a royal welcome when the Emir of Qatar owns more land in London than the king does? When it owns London's tallest tower, money goes a long way. And they have unlimited, bottomless buckets of it, and barely any citizens to spend it on. So they're able to buy a huge amount of influence while poisoning minds around the world through Al Jazeera, through AJ+, the millennial and Gen Z version that I think most consumers don't even realize is run by an Islamist dictatorship where being gay is illegal. And of course, being the global center of the Muslim Brotherhood and increasingly the spearhead of the radical axis in the Middle East. But as I said, money buys silence.
Do you feel like Israel's strike on Qatar had anything to do with, Qatar suddenly having Hamas release the rest of the hostages?
There are several different accounts of whether the attack on the Hamas leaders in Qatar helped or hindered. One account says that it spooked the Qataris and they realized that they needed to get Hamas to comply quickly. Another account says that Trump got fed up with Israel and decided that that was trying to strong-arm Israel into a deal. I think historians are going to have to judge on the basis of a lot of evidence that isn't out there just yet. But I think it is an important message that the Qataris realized that they could not give safe haven to terrorists, and that Israel really means it when it says that it will hunt these people down to the ends of the earth. I think the international reaction was vastly hypocritical. I mean, just look at how the world reacted when the United States eliminated bin Laden on Pakistani soil. People didn't complain that the US violated Pakistan's sovereignty. The question was, why was Pakistan using its sovereignty to harbor terrorists in the first place? And I don't think that Qatar should be allowed to host Hamas leaders on its soil. I think they should be shunned and they should be expelled. And that should have been the demand from the beginning.
Now, how central do you think the Muslim Brotherhood is to understanding political Islam in the West? And why is it often treated as a legitimate partner rather than an ideological threat?
Muslim Brotherhood is political Islam. That is what the movement is. And I think that Western countries are waking up a little bit too late to the Muslim Brotherhood's efforts to penetrate and infiltrate their institutions. I saw a shocking headline last week that the UAE is stopping to pay scholarships to send its own students to British universities for fear that they're going to be radicalized there. And I think that tells you all you need to know.
Now, you debated Mehdi Hasan, someone many still view as a serious journalist. What did that exchange reveal, and why does Hamas apologists often wear the language of human rights?
Hamas apologist, anti-Semite, Holocaust denier. I think it's very important to hold Mehdi Hasan to account for being a Holocaust denier when he claims that more journalists were killed in Gaza than in the First World War, the Second World War, and every subsequent war. We don't have to haggle about which of the so-called journalists in Gaza were in fact Hamas operatives to realize the claim that more journalists were killed in Gaza than in the entire Holocaust is obviously insane, and that qualifies him as a Holocaust denier. It's very clear to me what Mehdi Hasan is trying to do. He's trying to get us killed. Mehdi Hasan is trying to get us killed. The reason to call us genocidal is to make killing us a moral act. That's why it was important for me to stand up to him on a stage and do the best that I could. I don't think I was on totally top form that night, but do the best I can to put him in his box and in his place. And you asked before about how Iran uses Israel as a wedge issue. This is exactly how the anti-Israel movement is using Israel as a wedge issue. They dress up an annihilationist movement that wants to destroy the Middle East's only democracy in the language of democracy and freedom and human rights and international law in order to make it palatable to people who buy into that language. And they very effectively monopolize that. And I think Mehdi is very effective in using that language to shield some of the absolute worst people on the planet.
Now, you've declined gladiator style formats like Piers Morgan. What's broken about those debates? And do these shows reward outrage over clarity? You have people like Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian who are constantly shouting over the pro-Israel side. What do you think about this, format of debate?
Yeah, they keep inviting me. I keep getting invited to take part in Piers Morgan's bear baiting, and I just think the Jewish people have suffered enough. I think we would all be much better off if the pro-Israel side boycotted Piers Morgan's show and let all the anti-Semites scream at each other. I don't know what I've done to deserve being stuck between frothing at the mouth anti-Semites on the left and the right and have them shout at me. And I think it's disgusting that Piers Morgan has so effectively monetized the global obsession with Israel and Jews and anti-Israel hatred and keeps bringing back anti-Semites. And then he's shocked when he pretends he's shocked when they say something completely outrageous, and then he keeps inviting them back. Every time Candace Owens opens her mouth with the next stupid shit she says, she becomes more valuable as a guest on his show. People need to realize he keeps inviting back swivel-eyed lunatics, not despite the fact they're swivel-eyed lunatics, but because they are. I don't think that it's a format that lends itself to serious debate or intellectual inquiry. He's just always trying to nail someone on a gotcha. And most deplorably, just, take a Dan Bilzerian or Candace Owens on the right, and then Anna Kasparian and Cenk Uygur on the left, and put some poor Jew in the middle and just sit back and rub his hands as he sees his YouTube monetization going up and up and up every time they spray more spit at them.
And the way he treats, for example, Natasha Hausdorff, the one time she was on the show, shows his double standard, in my opinion.
The way he treated Natasha on the show was repulsive. And I don't know if you saw, he later tweeted that he tried to talk to her at a garden party and she didn't want to speak to him. And he was acting offended on Twitter about that. I said, mate, if a girl doesn't want to talk to you at a party, just drop it. But not only haranguing a guest on the show, but harassing her at a party as well shows that, he sees this as the Jerry Springer, the Jerry Springerification of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Look, it's a very effective business strategy. I'm sure he's done very well out of it, but I don't think it's contributed at all to global understanding of a very complex issue. His interview with Nick Fuentes didn't expose him. It introduced Nick Fuentes to a whole new audience. And I think he is, look, I don't believe in no platforming, but when your whole strategy is based on taking crazy people and bringing them on and on and on again, you are responsible for the complete corruption of public discourse.
There's a growing isolationist strain on the right that views Israel as a liability. Why does that, or does that worry you?
Yeah, of course it worries me that there is a fringe of the Republican Party that does not understand that Israel is an ally in this region, that does not understand how much the United States has gained from the intelligence cooperation and military cooperation with Israel, the extent to which Israel reflects Western values and is by far the most pro-American country in the region. We've seen the damage that's been done on the left, and there is a fear now of a pincer movement between the crazies on the left and the crazies on the right. They will end up doing incredible self-sabotage to the United States, of course, if they try to cut off this relationship. But you really see it, especially with the young generation, that they don't necessarily approach the issue rationally. Israel has become part of a culture war. Problem is when it becomes a battering ram in a culture war on both sides, and then we get squeezed in the middle.
If you could force the world to understand one thing about Israel, what would that be? And if you could just leave us with a final message for the
that there is nothing Israelis would like more than to be left the hell alone. You hear all sorts of nonsense about they want a greater Israel from the Nile to the Euphrates, and they want this and they want that. Really, what most Israelis want is to wake up in the morning, get to work without being stuck in traffic, keep their families safe, not have to deal with terrorism, be able to travel around the world as free people, equal people, with their heads held up high. Israel wants to build. Israelis want to have normal lives. And the problem is, too often around the world, people discuss Israel through the lens of their own culture wars and project their own neuroses onto Israel, instead of looking at a country of people who came here because they want a fresh start from history. And history keeps chasing us.
Yeah. Eylon, I want to thank you for your time, for everything that you do for the state of Israel, for the Jewish people, and
Thank you.
wish you the best of luck and success in all your endeavors.
Thank you.